Tuesday, 14A. Mrs. Howard put 320 books on 4 shelves in the school library. She put 95 books on the first shelf. She put the same number of books on the other 3 shelves. Which diagram shows a way to find B, the number of books on the last shelf? So we're trying to solve for B, the number of books on the last shelf. So we know that Mrs. Howard put 320 books. Those are all the books she had, and she put them on 4 shelves. She put 95 books on the first shelf, and then she put the same number of books on the other 3 shelves. So again, we are going to look for, we only had 320 books. That was our total. So we know that our answer, so I'm going to put a T right there. We know that our answer cannot be greater than 320. So A is showing us a total of 320. This one could be my answer, right? Let's look at B. B is not showing me a total of 320. This answer would be greater than 320. C is showing me 320 4 times, so I know I would have to multiply here, and my answer would be greater than 320. So C is out. So here we are also showing a total of 320, so that's also a possibility. So then we know that she put 95 books on the first shelf. Well, this is not showing me that she put 95 books on the first shelf. This one is. This is the first shelf, and then it says she put the same number of books on 3 shelves. Well, this one is showing me that she put the same number of books on 4 shelves. So A is out. Let's see this one. This one is showing me that she put the same number on 3 shelves. So D is your answer. 14B. A passenger jet had a total of 237 seats in 3 sections. There are 77 seats in the middle section of seats. The left and right sections have the same number of seats. Which diagram shows a way to find S, the number of seats in the left section of seats? So this is what we're solving for. We're trying to find S, the number of seats in the left section of seats. So a passenger jet had a total of 237 seats in 3 sections. So we know that it's broken up into 3 sections, and there was a total of 237. There are 77 seats in the middle. The left and right have the same number. So the left and right have the same number. So let's look for our strip diagram that is showing us a total of 237 seats. So we know that this one is not showing us a total of 237 seats. This one is not showing us a total of 237 seats. This one is showing us 3 groups of 237. So we know that our answer would be greater. We would have to do 237 times 3. So G is out. This one, letter H, is showing me a total of 237. J is showing me a total of 237. But now we need to go find the rest of our information. There are 77 seats in the middle section. Left and right have the same number. So let's look for the one that has 77 seats. And here it is. This one does not have 77. This one is telling me that they all had the same number of seats. So my answer is H.